Hi guys, Andy here and welcome back to the Scale Model Shed YouTube channel. And in this video I'm going to be building AFV Club's AVRE version of the Centurion Mk.5. And the kit includes a rifled metal barrel, rubberized mantlet cover, sprung workable suspension and photo etch parts. I get quite a few customers coming into the shop who used to work on or drive these Centurion AVREs. And after waiting a while for this model to come back into stock, I was pretty excited to build it. I haven't built a tank for quite a while, so I felt a little bit out of my comfort zone, but here we go. Okay, so as always I definitely recommend having a decent pair of sprue cutters to remove the parts from the sprues, as this will minimise the amount of work necessary to clean up the parts. And throughout the build I'm going to be using Tamiya's extra thin cement. And once the lower hull is glued together, the workable suspension assemblies can be fitted. I'm going to pre-assemble the whole kit before I paint it, and it's only really the wheels and the tracks that I'm going to paint off the model. This kit is by no means perfect, and these injector pin marks on the outside face of the driver's hatch are a case in point. And even though they're in a pretty awkward place, they're an easy fix with some Mr. Hobby dissolve putty. For gluing any photo etch I use VMS's Flexi CA glue, and these micro brushes are a perfect way of applying it. No glue is applied to the Dozer blade pivots, allowing the blade to be positioned freely in its up or down position. And again here there's some injector pin marks that need sorting out. There's no positive location points to position the Dozer blade brackets. When gluing them on, just ensure that they're centralised. Now I move on to assembling the turret. After inserting the metal barrel, the breech mechanism locks it in its correct position. The bore fume extractor is positioned by two flats in the barrel, and this ensures the seam down its side is in the correct position. The glue seam is carefully scraped back using a sharp scalpel blade. It's then carefully sanded to ensure I don't get a flat spot. And I'll check for any ghost seam when it comes to the painting stage. You'll find on this kit quite a few areas where you need to remove tabs from the parts, and again a nice pair of flat edge sprue cutters comes in handy. I'm now nearly getting to the point where I can start painting, but first this glue seam around the top of the turret needs looking at. Storage boxes cover the vast majority of this seam, So I mark their position on the turret with a pencil so I know the parts of the seam I need to concentrate on. After losing this step, which is quite big in places, I'm going to need to retexturise the surface. And there's all sorts of ways of doing this, but I thought I'd experiment using this anti-slip paste to create the texture. I masked the clear sight glasses on the periscopes using this masking fluid. The turret basket on the Centurion AVRE was usually mounted on the back of the turret. But if the tank was carrying the fascine on the front, the basket was removed from the turret and mounted on the rear deck of the tank. And the turret was positioned facing backwards. And this is the configuration that I'm going to be building the model. I just think it will look more interesting and it will give me the option to fit the fascine on the front in the future. After I assemble the whole model together, just because I couldn't resist it, I take everything back off again, and now we're ready for paint. I'm going to start by priming the whole thing black, and for this I use Mr. Finishing Surface of 1500 mixed with 50% levelling thinner. And when it's all primed in black it looks awesome, but doesn't everything always look good in primer? But we can't leave it like that, so I'm going to use SMS Cark Green as my base colour. And that references back to the FS 34094 Bronze Green. And as usual with these SMS paints, straight into the airbrush and straight on the model. So now we've got an even thin coating of Cark Green, I'm going to do the camouflage colour using Cark Black. And while I'm at it I paint the wheels, and some are green and some are black depending on where the camouflage meets them. And I'm going to initially paint the mantlet cover in sail colour, and we'll come back to how to make it look more realistic later. I also include a continuation of the black camouflage onto the fabric. And this bit probably turned out to be a little bit pointless, but I added some olive green to the cart green and added some highlights to the top surfaces of the tank. So there's the basic paint colours down, and before I move to the decals, I'm just going to add some detail highlights. I mixed Tamiya olive green and sky to create a green that's significantly lighter than the Cark green base. I then go over any rivets, bolts and small raised detail with this green. And this effect will be toned down during later weathering effects, but will give these items a little bit more definition on the finished model. The decals are fairly small and the paint finish is nice and smooth, so they're applied straight onto the paint without a gloss coat. And I lay the decal down on top of a coat of microset, and then I apply some microsol just to help it bed down. And once the decal's been allowed to dry for 24 hours, any imperfections can be cleaned up with a very fine polishing pad. The whole model is then given a coat of my favourite GX113 flat varnish, and this is thinned with 60 to 70% levelling thinner. So now on to simulating some paint abrasion, and I use this AK 3rd Gen Silver Grey. To prevent the paint from drying too quickly, I apply a drop of VMS's acrylic paint retarder. I then apply the paint to a piece of sponge and offload the vast majority of it onto a paper towel. I then go round and apply subtle chipping to any exposed surfaces around the tank. And one thing I'm not going to do anywhere on the main body of this tank is apply any rust. This chipping is purely to simulate paint abrasion. And I think the only place I'm going to apply some rust effect later on is going to be around the exhaust covers. In the very few areas that the paint has worn right down to steel, I use a very dark brown, and in this case it's Vallejo's German Camo Black Brown. And this is applied just leaving the tiniest bit of the pale green around the outside edge. After that's done, I moved on to weathering, and being a Royal Engineers vehicle and likely being used for demolition, I decided that I'd weather the tank to be covered in dried mud and dust. And for this I'm going to use VMS's Alkyd binders and pigments. Pigments are great for creating dusty effects because they are just dust. And the alkyd binders give you quite a special advantage when it comes to using them. This particular one is a matte effect pigment binder that you can mix with pigments to create a paste. Then once dried, this paste remains workable for up to 9 hours before drying to a permanent finish. To the lower hull, no skill is required and the paste is applied everywhere. And having a hairdryer on hand is a must to speed up the drying time of these alkyd binders. And anywhere you want higher build-up, just apply the pigment in a thicker layer. Once dry, the pigment can then be worked with a brush or a cocktail stick to create the desired effects. Anywhere you don't want the pigment, you can remove it completely, and anywhere you want some build-up, you can leave. And as I mentioned earlier, even though the pigments are dry, the alkyd binders will remain them workable for up to 9 hours. Some areas you may wish to return back to original paintwork, and this is where Universal Weathering Carrier Light Type comes in. And this is basically a very mild enamel thinners. And it can be used to wash the pigments away completely and blend them. Flooding the area with Universal Weathering Carrier will suspend the pigments and allow them to settle in a much more natural manner. You can then dry the pigment carrier off with a hairdryer and do any final necessary blending with a brush. Any pigments where they shouldn't be are easily cleaned off. So this gives us our basic mud on the lower hull. And one step I did take, which is probably unnecessary, is to lighten up the top of the suspension units by spraying some Tamiya buff. But you can experiment a lot around the wheels of a Centurion, because let's face it, it's all going to be covered up by the side skirts in the end. I then blended in some dark brown pigment, and you'll see in a moment that much of this gets fixed into place when I use some oil washes. I then create a wash from Abtielung's engine grease and their matte effect thinner. As you can see, where the oil wash is applied, it soaks into the pigment, leaving an excellent effect when it's dry. So with the lower hull complete, I move away from mud and turn to the exhausts. After painting the exhausts in German grey, I take an off-white. And white is a great colour to simulate burnt off paint and metal that's got hot. I would think the paint comes off these exhaust covers fairly rapidly, but I wanted to make them more interesting than just a large sheet of rusted metal. It may not look like it at first, but I'm going to keep the rust effect fairly minimal on these covers. I love using these rust liquid pigments from Life Colour. And when they first go on they look far too vibrant, but when they dry they tone down to just the right shade. and then finishing off by applying some black pigment ties the whole lot together. And this pigment is fixed in place using some pigment fixer. And moving on to the upper hull, and the front end of the tank, which is the dirtiest, is much the same to weather as the lower hull. It's set maybe using a little bit more finesse. One thing you have to bear in mind when you start down the road of making any model look dusty is that you have to carry that dust through onto every surface of the model. If you leave any section completely clean, you run the risk of it looking out of place. And it's likely that even the lightest, most subliminal bit of dust is going to be necessary. One technique I use a lot on the upper hull is using the pigment almost like a panel line wash and flooding the area with universal weathering carrier and letting the pigments flow into all the nooks and crannies. And a lot of the time it may look like you're just spreading about neat thinners, but when it dries you'll notice there's actually a lot of pigment being carried. Now onto the mantlet cover, and I started by mixing faded green and sepia oils into a thick wash. This was then applied heavily all over the surface that I painted in sail colour earlier. The oil paint was then slightly mottled using a cotton bud and left to dry. Once dry, the cover was given a matte, dusty look by applying neat pigment. Bearing in mind that universal weathering carrier is an enamel thinner, it was applied over the top of the pigment, which kind of melted it into the oils. And when this dried and everything matted off, the effect was pretty good. The possibilities with this pigment paste is endless, and here I used it for streaking. Okay, so now I'm moving on to the defining piece of the AVRE tank, the Dozer blade. And the first thing to do is to take some of this paint back to shiny, freshly abrased, bright metal. And for this I used Mig Ammo's polished metal and a sponge. And next is to take out all the paint and rust up the upper section of the dozer blade. I then make a wash from sepia oil and matte effect thinner and go about doing some staining and highlighting some areas such as hinges. And this is a good time to make all those pivots on the dozer arms nice and oily. I used some sand, which was roughly the right colour, to introduce some larger particles around the front end of the tank. And these were then fixed in position with VMS's sand and ballast freeze. And once these are dry and set in position, I would later dust these with some pigment to bring the colour tone into line. To add some variation, I also added some simulated concrete dust. Being a demolition vehicle, I thought I'd experiment by trying to make some bricks using brick dust pigment and the outclip binders. And after a day of drying in the mould, these brick fragments are looking pretty good. Okay, so onto the wheels. In order to make the tyres look more realistically like rubber, I took some chunks out of them using a scalpel blade. I then put some splits in the rubber using a razor saw. The tyre is then painted in rubber black. This is also a good technique to use to help make the tyre look like rubber when it's basically the same colour as the wheel. And then more pigments and universal weathering carrier. The wheels are then fitted in the correct position to correspond with the camouflage pattern. I didn't want the hush puppy tracks to look nice and new, so I stabbed them repeatedly with a scalpel, and that seemed to do the trick. After airbrushing the tracks in Tamiya rubber black, track wash was applied to the metal parts of the track, avoiding any contact areas where the wheel's rubber tyres would run. The obligatory dust was then applied. I then rubbed some graphite over any metal parts of the track. And then the joins held together using a supplied steel pin. Any areas such as latches and hinges are also rubbed with a small amount of graphite. Including the fascine carrier, which was finished in a very similar way to the Dozer blade. Weathering the side skirts was pretty easy. Applying the dust pigment and alka binders paste to the top surfaces, and then flooding it with universal weathering carrier, allowing the pigments to flow naturally downwards. And after drying with a hairdryer, I adjusted any pigments that looked out of place. And then I blended the pigments just using my thumb. And the pigment paste can also be used by splattering with a brush. Once finished, the side skirts are glued into position using VMS's Flexi CA glue. The bricks I made earlier are glued into position around the front of the tank using CA glue. I made a tarp to drape over the turret basket that's mounted on the back of the tank. For this I used VMS's paper shaper and their WFU modelling paper. And after the paper had been cut to size, it was soaked in the paper shaper solution and positioned on the model. The paper was moulded into shape using a brush and applying more solution if necessary. I decided to make the tarp blue, and once it was dry it got a wash of faded blue oil paint. And finally I used Albion Alloy's 0.33 nickel silver rod to make the aerials. And pilot holes were drilled in the aerial mounts to position these into. So that's it for this one guys, and remember you can buy all the VMS products from me at scalemodelsshed.co.uk. And while you're there, have a good browse around the site, as I'm always increasing the variety of products in stock. And as usual, thank you so much for watching, and a big thank you to all my subscribers. See you guys in the next video, take care and happy modelling.